Welcome back everyone. This is a very important video session. In today's session, I'm going to discuss 40 most important give reasons from the short story The Cookie Lady written by Philip K.Dick. Do check the pinned comment section for the line-by-line explanation video. And dear students, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and also tap the bell icon for all notifications. As far as the question answers are concerned, short answer questions, long answer questions, don't worry, I'm going to upload another video for that. For the time being, let's focus on these important give reasons. Question 1. Ernie Mill shouted from across the street, fixing papers for his route because he, being inquisitive, what is the meaning of inquisitive? Curious. He, being inquisitive, wanted to know where his friend Bubber was going. So we have two friends we all know by now, Ernie Mill and Bubber. And when Ernie Mill saw Bubber going to Mrs. Drew's house, Ernie Mill shouted from across the street, wanting to know where his friend was going. Being inquisitive, he was actually inquisitive, curious. Now, you must write one single reason in your own words with suitable textual reference. But remember, one single reason, one single brief reason. Question 2. Bubber did not disclose the place where he was going because he knew that Ernie Mill, who was inquisitive and somewhat nosy, would tease him. See, I have also underlined the keywords and expressions for you. He knew that Ernie would tease him for his closeness with his friend, old Mrs. Drew. Now, our protagonist, Bubber, had another friend. And who was this friend? Old Mrs. Drew. Next, number 3. Ernie laughed and laughed on seeing Bubber going towards the old lady's house because he found the friendship between young Bubber, young is important, and the old lady, old is important, strange, weird. Wondered what could be the purpose of Bubber's regular visits to her house. So, this is a compact reason. He found the friendship between two people who had an age difference, a significant age difference, strange and weird, and he also wanted to know why Bubber would go to her house regularly. Or, so I have given you another probable reason for this question. Or, he was somewhat nosy, playful and made fun of Bubber's friendship with the old woman and his regular visits to her house. So, you can add nosy, playful, and he actually made fun. And therefore, he laughed and laughed. Question 4. See, I have written brief reasons, compact reasons. And I have read the text thoroughly to write these reasons. Bubber's mouth began to water on reaching Mrs. Drew's house because, why? Because he could smell the delicious cookies being baked by Mrs. Drew. The aroma was wonderful, warm, tempting, increasing his craving for them. So I have packed in so much information in this single brief reason. Number 1, he could smell the cookies. And number 2, cookies were being baked by Mrs. Drew. Number 3, the aroma was fantastic, wonderful, warm, tempting as well. And next, and this increased his craving for them. I'm sure if you write like this, you're going to get good marks. Bubber's heart thudded with anticipation because, here again I have given you two probable reasons. You may choose any one. Because the wonderful warm aroma of the freshly baked cookies increased his appetite. Number 1, and he hoped that he would be soon served the delicious cookies. He would soon get to eat the delicious cookies which were freshly baked, and the aroma, the fragrance was superb, wonderful and warm, inviting, increasing his appetite for them. Or You may write this reason also. He felt excited. He was excited. Anticipation, thudding of the heart. He felt excited at the prospect of being served delicious cookies by Mrs. Drew to satiate his craving for them. Both are compact reasons. So, these are reference reasons. Once again, a reminder. Dear students, go through the entire session, take help and frame your own answers depending on the questions available. I keep on repeating this because English literature is subjective. You are free to write, frame your own answers. 6. Mrs. Drew offered Bubber not only cookies but also a glass of cold milk because she knew cold milk would complement the cookies and Bubber would enjoy the wholesome snack. So this was perhaps her idea, but there may be another reason for this, and I have mentioned that also. She knew that Bubber was a glutton. He loved eating, craved for the freshly baked cookies, and it would be easier for her to tempt him by complimenting cookies with cold milk. So it was her sinister move to tempt Bubber. In reality, Mrs. Drew appeared to be a kind woman, and apparently this was the reality. But actually, according to the plot twist, what do we find? Mrs. Drew was not that kind, was not actually kind at all, innocent at all, but she was an evil person and she did all these things in order to tempt Bubber, in order to lure Bubber into a trap. Next, Mrs. Drew is compared to the weeds that grew along the front of the house because the weeds were old and dry, rustling in the wind, and Mrs. Drew was a little dried up old lady, both withered. The weeds were withered, unkempt, and Mrs. Drew was also dried up, withered, shriveled old lady, lacking youthfulness, wrinkled and fragile. Therefore, the comparison. Another compact reason, very well written. Next, Bubber continued visiting the old lady, Mrs. Drew, despite being teased by Ernie because Mrs. Drew's house served as a world of wish fulfillment for him. Number 1. Number 2, he felt comfortable there. Number 3, enjoyed Mrs. Drew's company. Number 4, ate delicious cookies. In this way, I have packed in 4 reasons in a single reason. So, this is the trick which you must apply if you want to impress the examiner. And you will have to do it really judiciously, really wisely. And that will come with practice. So, practice a lot. Read the text thoroughly. Next, when Bubber had finished eating the cookies, he glanced towards the kitchen again. Why? Because there were some more cookies on the stove and he felt greedy for them also. See, I have highlighted all the important words and expressions. His appetite still unsatiated. He wanted more despite finishing 1 plate of cookies already. So he wanted more. The kitchen is an important setting in the Cookie Lady because it is here that Mrs. Drew bakes delicious cookies that hold a special allure for Bubber, and she utilizes these cookies in order to tempt Bubber. So kitchen, an important setting. Mrs. Drew asks Bubber to stay and talk to her for a while because number 1, she lives alone in the house. Number 2, she is lonely. Number 3, she enjoys the company of Bubber. But is this the whole reality? No. We all know that actually she has some evil plans in her mind. Yes, she is lonely, but she has other motives as well. Mrs. Drew asks Bubber if he would read to her from his books because her eyesight has weakened due to her old age and it is comfort to her to be read to. So another apparent reason, but actually we know inwardly she harbors sinister thoughts and plans. So this is the significance of the plot twists introduced in the story. In the line-by-line explanation video, I have discussed the horror genre for you. Go through that session as well, the line-by-line explanation video, so that you can write any answer on your own coming from this chapter, from this story. Mrs. Drew was silent while Bubber read from the big blue book because she was engrossed in watching Bubber read minutely, observing his bodily movements, studying him intently, closely, enjoying his youthful presence in such close proximity. She was so close to Bubber. The old woman was so close to this young boy. Mrs. Drew found herself saying, just let me add, saying strange things and doing strange things because she suffered from loneliness for a long time. And when she saw Bubber, she thought that she would be getting a friend. She could make friendship with Bubber, but actually she had other plans as well. Mrs. Drew closed her eyes and folded her hands in her lap because she was comfortable, relaxed, peaceful while dozing and listening to Bubber reading from the big blue book. Mrs. Drew began to change as she was dozing and listening to Bubber because her grey wrinkles and lines were dimming away. She was growing younger and was regaining her youth. Next, Mrs. Drew breathed deeply, not opening her eyes because she felt good without knowing what exactly was happening to her, yet relished the renewed youthful vitality and did not want the moment to slip away. She wanted to preserve this moment. She did not want the moment to slip away. She was enjoying regaining her youth. When Bubber left Mrs. Drew's house after having filled his pockets, he felt tired because Mrs. Drew had been funneling Bubber's youthful vitality into herself, resulting in the boy's physical deterioration, physical weakness and physical impoverishment. Tears blurred the old lady's eyes when Bubber left her house because her transformation and youthful rejuvenation was temporary, very, very important, reverting to her aged state, and the lady was sad. So sadness, grief, because she was old again. The change was just temporary. It was not permanent. The old lady requested Bubber to come back again because not only was it nice to have Bubber in her house to relieve her of her loneliness, but also she regained her lost youth whenever Bubber was by her side. So twofold reason. Bubber's parents are curious about his time with the old lady because they observe that Bubber is always washed out, very strange, exhausted after he has been visiting Mrs. Drew regularly for a month, but they do not know the root cause. So it's not moment, it's month. So I'll just do the correction. They are worried for Bubber. Bubber's father asks Bubber not to visit the old lady anymore because he dislikes and is suspicious of her. Suspicious of Mrs. Drew. Does not want the boy to feed on cookies on returning home feeling tired. So number 1, dislike, suspicion. Number 2, does not want the boy to feed on cookies. Or number 3, return home feeling tired. Mrs. Drew's wrinkled face broke into smiles and she greeted Bubber into her house because whenever Bubber visited her, she felt so young again in his presence. Bubber was perplexed. He was confused to see the chair because he noticed that the table and the lamp were gone and the chair was right up next to the couch. So Mrs. Drew had rearranged the pieces of furniture and this was again strange. Mrs. Drew's aged heart, very important, thumped because Bubber, the plump boy, was sitting just a little distance from her. And this proximity, closeness excited her to be young again. Very important. Mrs. Drew stopped, standing rigid because Bubba revealed it was his last visit to her house according to his father's instructions. Or, another probable reason, she was shocked to hear that it was the last time Bubba was visiting her. Next, everything seemed to leap around Mrs. Drew, the room twisting furiously because Bubba's revelation that he was visiting for the last time was a jolt to her, a shock. And she was emotionally disturbed. Therefore, everything was twisting. She was emotionally disturbed. Anxiety. The sight of a woman drinking a big chocolate soda made Bubba to increase his pace a little towards his destination because he was a glutton. His appetite was increased and the sight intensified his craving for the delicious cookies baked by Mrs. Drew. Where was the destination? Mrs. Drew's house. The old lady had removed the table and the lamp from the living room because she wanted to be closer to Bubba, foreshadowing her sinister attempt to channelize his youthfulness into herself. The physical proximity, closeness, the contact. The old lady trembled with fear. Now in the workbook, it's written fear, but in the text it is written anguish, so I'll keep it anguish only. The old lady trembled with anguish when she touched her forehead and found her skin dry and brittle like old paper because she experienced a sense of loss and shock. Important to know that Bubba would never pay her a visit. Henceforth, it was the last time and she would not feel young again. So, she trembled with anguish, sadness. When Bubba visited the old lady's house for the last time, she hurriedly went to her bedroom because she wanted to admire her youthful appearance by gazing into the full-length mirror on the door of the bedroom. Admiration of herself, of her beauty. Vanity of greed and vanity of Mrs. Drew. Mrs. Drew's eyes flashed. She smiled because she was happy to be young and lovely again, and her youthful appearance reflected in the mirror would last forever. Very, very important. Or, her eyes flashed, she smiled because of the realization that she had regained her youth and it would last forever, irrespective of Bubba's presence in her house. Whether Bubba came or whether Bubba did not come, no problem at all. She was permanently young. Her youth was restored. Bubba looked dull and dead white because Mrs. Drew had fulfilled her sinister motive to draw out the boy's life force, vitality and vigor to rejuvenate herself, leaving the boy weak and drained physically. So he looked dull. His life force was taken away by Mrs. Drew. Bubba went slowly down the steps of Mrs. Drew's house one at a time because his health deteriorated. He became physically weak after Mrs. Drew robbed him of his life force. Impoverished health, strength, physical strength. No physical strength left in Bubba. Mrs. Drew unfastened her dress and stepped out of it because she was filled with happiness and satisfaction to regain her youth permanently, and she wanted to admire the reflection of her full rounded body in the mirror. Very, very, very important question. And the reason is also so well written, so compact yet brief. So many important elements packed in a single reason. 35. Mrs. Drew admired the reflection of her youthful body in the mirror because she was no longer old, had a wonderful body bursting with life, and this transformation would not fade away. The most important point, it would not fade away. It was not temporary. It was finally permanent. While returning home, Babur felt the wind hammering at him, pushing and plucking at him because his physical strength was gone. He was weary, his arms and legs were weak, unable to resist the force of the cold wind, the intensity of the strong wind. And it was cold also, chilling wind. Mrs. Drew laughed gaily when she bid goodbye to Babur on his last visit to her house because she was remorseless, very important, unkind, very important, and selfish, hardly bothered about Babur's health, but was happy for herself after regaining her youth. She did not want Babur anymore. Whether she was lonely or not hardly mattered, but actually her purpose was fulfilled. She was now youthful forever. Restoration of her youth and transformation, physical transformation. Mrs. Drew asked Babur to read to her and she touched his arm because the direct physical contact between the two would enable her to draw out his life force and rejuvenate her lost youth, while Babur would not notice her sinister moves. Babur would be busy reading. She would draw out the life force and Babur would not notice anything because he would be reading to her. So clever, so cunning. Babur filled his mouth and pockets with cookies because he had a craving for them, and this was the last time he would get them from Mrs. Drew. So he wanted to take as many as possible. And the last one. Dear students, I have taken some questions from the workbooks available in the market, and I have also framed some questions exclusively for you so that you can have a thorough revision. Ralph and May were repeatedly checking for the boy and were concerned when they saw the windy weather because it was dark and quite late and Babur had not yet returned home, making them anxious and worried as his parents. So parental concern.